I ask everyone to take a seat and we'll start the program momentarily. Everyone could please take a seat. If everyone could please find a seat. Wow. Thank you, sir. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Civil War Roundtable. As you all know, the Union League Legacy Foundation is the charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. One of the things that we do is exhibits, and we have an exhibit that we rotate through every year or two on the ground floor of this great building on Broad Street in the Sir John Templeton Heritage Center. And this, how many have been in the current exhibit, which is A City Divided, the Civil War of Philadelphia? Just show of hands. Okay. So it's right on point with tonight's talk. Tonight's talk, we're going to hear from Joe, is some political philosophy, of course, Lincoln, Douglas, and about this division. And if you want to learn more about that, and you see some of the great artifacts that this institution has, please go down and see this great exhibit. Bring your friends down to it. It's open every day, Monday through Friday during business hours, and often in the evening. It'll be open after this exhibit, after this program, if you want to go down. So please go down and see some of the wonderful things in your Union League collection. Of course, we do a lot of other things, and we're in the middle of many of them, including our scholarship programs, Good Citizen Day, and a series of lecture programs that we have through the month of June. We hope you'll come to many of those in the coming weeks and months. All of this is made possible, of course, through voluntary contributions mostly from our members, and we thank you for your support. I want to thank Gary Dorsheimer, Dr. Gary, who's the head of that development effort. Thank you, Gary, for everything that you do for the Legacy Foundation and the Union League. A couple pieces of housekeeping. Please turn off or silence at least your cell phone. And I'm going to take a moment, and you were going to do that because last time we had some problems with that. Please silence your cell phone. That would be wonderful. The program tonight will have a Q&A portion. We would ask you, of course, to use the microphone because we are streaming live so that we can hear your questions. And of course, as always, we want to keep them to a couple of sentences, and they must be questions. We will have plenty of speechifying from Joe. That's why he's here. And we look forward to your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. And now to introduce our program is the historian of the Union League Legacy Foundation, the one, the only, Mr. Jim Mundy. Jim.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, a healthy audience. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Dr. Joseph Fornieri is professor of political science at the Rochester Institute of Technology and the director of the Center for Statecraft, Law, and Liberty, a nonpartisan organization that seeks to enhance the study of political greatness and responsible citizenship at the secondary and college levels. An award-winning instructor, Fornieri teaches classes in American political thought and leadership, rhetoric, political philosophy, and the First Amendment. Sounds like college from 50 years ago, which is great. Seriously, so that's great stuff. He is the author of several books on the 16th president, including Abraham Lincoln's Political Faith and Abraham Lincoln, Philosopher Statesman. A former high school teacher, Fornieri's mission includes outreach to secondary teachers and students throughout the country, including leading seminars at one of our partner organizations, Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge. He is now working on a book comparing and contrasting the political thought and leadership of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, which just happens to be the subject of his talk this evening. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Joseph Fornieri to the Union League and tonight's program.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I was at this Union League a year ago, and I'm just absolutely delighted and honored to be here. I was taken into the inner sanctum of the cigar room with John Miko and Jason Rea, who I'd like to especially thank. Thank you, John, for having us here. I wanted to mention that, in fact, Lincoln didn't smoke cigars, but Frederick Douglass loved them. Neither of them drank. They were both teetotalers. But I did notice the illustrious wine cellar here. So your speaker likes some of that Montepulciano in moderation. But so a sincere thanks for inviting me to speak at this historic city and venue, right? The birthplace of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which I'll be speaking of tonight, really the focus of my remarks, and of course dedicated to the Union, the common object of both Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass's devotion and sacrifice. This place was dedicated to supporting Lincoln, we know, and it was the place where Douglass himself spoke in 1866. This evening speech, as you mentioned, is a preview of a book in progress that combines my passion for these two great men of both ideas and action, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, two patriots, two anti-slavery giants who worked in common cause to save the Union and to redeem our country from the original sin of human servitude. As a Lincoln scholar for the past 25 years, time goes by, and a native of Rochester, New York, Douglass's hometown and his final resting place at Mount Hope Cemetery, my interest in these two men may perhaps come as no surprise. But in my research, I have been surprised at the remarkable convergence, both politically and personally, between these men. And I think it can serve as an example for us today, especially in enhancing our devotion to the core principles which they shared. So my purpose this evening is to compare and contrast the anti-slavery beliefs of these two giants and contemporaries. One, a humble rail splitter from Illinois, the other, a former African-American slave. I wish to emphasize the continuity between them, and particularly in terms of their shared vision of the Union League, the Union, a theme I want to keep in sight the rest of this evening. A Union dedicated to the principles of the Declaration and its promise of universal freedom. I then conclude with some of Douglass's reflections on Lincoln after the assassination. And what follows, I will argue that their differences were primarily over the appropriate constitutional means, timing, and political expediency. These differences may also be attributed to their, as you could see, respective type of leadership and style. When we consider leadership, there are different kinds of leadership, all right? Douglass, the abolitionist, operated outside a major political party. Of course, he was an abolitionist, but his relationship with the Republican Party did not come till much later. And an official position in government. His role was that of an agitator, an uncompromising prophetic reformer who led the vanguard of public opinion on race and slavery. On the other hand, Lincoln, the president, was representative of both the party of which he was head, an entire country, a country that included the slaveholding border states who remained loyal to the Union. As such, he was constrained by an oath-bound duty to work within the constitutional limitations, popular consent, and elections within the rule of law. However, as I hope to show tonight, when circumstances changed, same principle, different circumstances. When these circumstances changed with the war, the same oath-bound duty empowered Lincoln to adopt more radical measures for dealing with slavery. And we see Douglas's convergence towards Lincoln in terms of becoming more political, and Lincoln's convergence with Douglas and becoming more radical and willing to consider measures that were otherwise prohibited in peacetime for dealing with slavery, namely the Emancipation Proclamation. In sum, the remarkable story of Lincoln and Douglas's personal and political convergence becomes all the more urgent given current challenges to our founding principles. This is the home of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Union League, all of which recently have been vilified or called into question, especially in the citadels of so-called higher education at times. This is urgent, as I said. One considers the 1619 Project and CRT. As I relaxed in my beautiful room here, I saw a Latin motto. I teach Roman political thought on the pillow, although it wasn't on the bathrobe. I checked, and it said "Amor Patriae Ducis," right? That love of country leads. This is we're motivated, as St. Augustine would say, by the object of our love. I always tell my students, you are what you love. Augustine was right. I think the Union League did its right. But it reminds me, sadly, of a recent poll released in March, in which surveyed the importance of different values to Americans of this generation. And it's interesting that and I think tragic that patriotism declined in importance of a value by half. And the question remains, can we sustain the Union that Lincoln and Douglas so hardly sacrificed for without some patriotic devotion, not an uncritical patriotism, but a patriotism that seeks to defend core principles and, like Douglas, to call out the nation when it fails to live up to those principles. Okay. I want to consider some of the remarkable parallels between Lincoln and Douglas's life. Both were men of speech. Both were rhetorical geniuses. If one wants to understand rhetoric, one wants to understand the English language and argumentation, you could do no better place than to study the speeches and writings of both Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Certainly, their ideas provide enduring wisdom about the principles, the perils and promise of the American experiment. We think of Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," or Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address as really the distillation of the essence of the American creed. They also were, interestingly enough, influenced by some of the same literary sources. I was struck by this. The Bible, of course. Both loved Shakespeare. Both loved the Scottish poet Byron, and both were profoundly influenced by this next work I want to discuss in a little more detail, the Columbian Orator. I'll speak to that in a moment. both were self-made men. Both were supreme autodidacts that were self-educated. Lincoln's education amounted to no more than a year of grammar school learning, right? And he taught himself Euclid, and he read Shakespeare voraciously and did everything he could to acquire books. And he was somewhat ashamed of his lack of education. He never really boasted about his rustic background, interestingly enough, although that was, something that was good for campaigns. Lincoln himself was reticent about this rustic background. Douglas, of course, famously, one of my favorite passages in Autobiography of a Slave is where he tells the story of exchanging baked goods with the white children nearby for letters. He would give them cookies and baked goods that he got as treats if they would demonstrate, how to write a letter L, and teach him phonetically how to sound it out. Absolutely remarkable, right? The beginning of his education, and here we have two geniuses who are self-educated. Now, of course, that's not a slap at current day education. Not everyone is a genius, but it does speak to native intelligence and to determination and self-improvement, which both these men emphasized throughout their life. That was part of the American dream: self-reliance and self-improvement. Not only were they men of speech, they were men of action. And I want to speak to this in a little more detail. Douglas is the agitator from outside the citadels of power, trying to push public opinion in the proper direction. When we read his speeches during the Civil War, he's constantly worried about the Union cause being demoralized. And by that, he means giving up the moral high ground of the core principles of the Declaration of Independence. For Douglas, this war was about slavery, and the war will not terminate until the cause of the war is destroyed. His logic is relentless and right on track. And of course, Lincoln, the statesman, who is bound by official duty within the citadels of power. But both were men of ideas. Both were men of profound thought who have much to say about the American experiment. As I mentioned, about the principles, perils, and promise of America. Great teachers of democracy. Now, I mentioned a moment ago this book called The Columbian Orator, which was a profound influence on both Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Interestingly enough, they read it about the same time in the 1830s. Douglas mentions this book and praises it in the highest terms in each of his three biographies. You never get bored with Douglas's biographies, so read all of them, right? There's some repetition, but you never get bored with them. In his writing, you're just to devour it. It's so contemporary, Douglas's writing, for some reason, his style. But he praises this work in each of his biographies. Let me say just a few things about it here. The Columbian Order was a collection of political writings. It was published in 1797 and edited by Caleb Bingham, a Congregationalist. It was so popular that it went through 23 editions. It consisted of 84 short selections of inspiring political speeches, poems, and dialogues. I subjected my students to this at RIT. I think they liked it. I don't know, but I subjected them to this, right? It included such diverse authors as Socrates, Philo, John Milton, Cicero, Benjamin Franklin, Washington, William Pitt the Younger, and also the champions of Irish independence. We know Douglas visited Ireland and had a relationship with the British abolitionists, and with the Irish. Most importantly, its view of the founding was decisively anti-slavery. This is as early as 1797. And Douglas is influenced by a dialogue in this work between a master and a slave. And in that dialogue, the master is finally persuaded that slavery is unjust and he frees the slave. This spoke to Douglas, right? And Douglas often said that in order to make a man a slave, you must enslave his mind. This influential and early anti-slavery interpretation of the American founding, of the Declaration of Independence, is saying what it means, that all men, all human beings are created equal. Even if we fail to live up to that standard, at least in principle, that's our aspiration, has been overlooked by the 1619 Project and other critiques of our founding. Notwithstanding that Douglas, one of the greatest African-American leaders in our history, praises its influence on his own intellectual development, as I had mentioned. Keep this in mind, and I invite you to have a look. I want to now consider really what I believe to be the essence of Lincoln's political thought. How do I make this accessible in the time I have? Well, Lincoln provides us with a metaphor from Proverbs 25:11, which I think captures the essence of his statesmanship, the broad goals and means that inform his leadership, the vision of his statesmanship. And of course, this is the passage is a word fitly spoken, is like apples of gold in a picture of silver, and pictures of silver. The context of this was during the secession winter. Historians think that Lincoln was replying to Alexander Stephens, who would become the vice president of the Confederacy. Stephens was Lincoln's colleague in the House of Representatives during the Mexican War. And remarkably, he was one of the few individuals who opposed Georgia's secession. So Lincoln thought that he might be able to cultivate Southern unionism through his old friend, Alexander Stephens. Of course, this didn't work out. He became vice president and wrote the perverse cornerstone speech, right? That slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. But in this speech to Lincoln, which we have, he urges the president-elect to break his silence. Lincoln was committed to a policy of silence during the secession winter. He thought that any word that he said would be used against him, and he went on record sufficiently to explain his views. So Stephen says to him, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a picture of silver. Give us assurances in the South, essentially. Lincoln takes this metaphor, and it was never published, but it was discovered after his assassination, written on scrap paper, and that was his modus operandi. He often wrote his thoughts on scrap paper and put them in his hat. And he would put them in his desk, and all these profound thoughts were discovered by his secretaries after he was assassinated. So really, this is a reflection on the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as the two moral covenants of the Union. Think of it as the American decalogues. You need both. Lincoln, in this reflection, considers as I say, Lincoln is a philosophical statesman. He actually quotes as, what was the philosophical cause of our success as a nation, of our liberty, of the opportunity that so many enjoy? And he says it's the principle of liberty to all, of freedom to all in the Declaration of Independence. And the Union is constituted by the Declaration of Independence as its apple of gold, its moral centerpiece. And the Constitution is the protective picture of silver that safeguards these principles. For Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and the Republicans, this is important, we've lost sight of this. The Constitution, interpreted correctly, incorporates and embodies the principles of the Declaration of Independence. This is the standard, these are the directives, the lens through which the Constitution should be read as much as possible under the circumstances, and without limitations to the contrary. Okay, in sum, the apple of gold in the picture of silver metaphor is a corresponding view of moral obligation to the natural law principles of equality, the laws of nature and nature's God, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the truth that all men, all human beings are created equal, and a corresponding legal obligation to the Constitution of the United States. And statesmanship involves a consideration and judicious balancing of both the apple of gold and the picture of silver. Lincoln says we should act as if neither should be bruised or broken. Using Lincoln's analogy to characterize the alternative views of his time, and perhaps even applying them to certain ideologies today, we could characterize the Garrisonian abolitionists as those who wanted the apple of gold without the picture of silver. The Constitution, in their view, was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. There could be no compromise with slaveholders. Dissolve the Union immediately. Douglas broke with the radical abolitionists, with the Garrisonians, because he realized that this type of political utopianism would not particularly ameliorate the condition of the slaves. What would happen if the northern states seceded? The slaves would be abandoned in the South, and the South may be free to spread its slave empire throughout the Caribbean. If you look at the Democratic platforms, both Democratic parties in 1860, they boast the annexation of Cuba as the next slave state. Okay? The political aspiration, as I said, utopianism may provide moral solace in the short term, but it may undermine the very ends it seeks to advance in the long term. Slavery was deeply entrenched in society for over 200 years prior to the Civil War, and states still had a great deal of autonomy. It could not be abolished immediately without overturning the entire legal and social fabric of society. And in an early speech, Lincoln warned of a towering genius, the Lyceum Address it was called in 1838, who would advance his personal ambition. It's remarkable, quote, at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men. Remarkable. Lincoln then gives the example of Napoleon, a despot who posed as a liberator. That the ideal can be an enemy of the good if it's not tempered by political moderation and prudence. By contrast, Lincoln's approach to ending slavery, to applying the universal principles of the Declaration of Independence, was to be incremental, prudent, within the boundaries of the rule of law, and with the broad consent of the states in support of public opinion. On the other hand, if we look at the Northern Democrats of Lincoln's time, like Stephen A. Douglas, and like Lincoln's opponent in the 1864 election, George B. McClellan, they wanted the picture of silver without the apple of gold. They did not accept the universality of the Declaration's principles. All men are created equal. They agreed with Roger B. Taney of Dred Scott fame, applied exclusively to white property holding males at the time of the founding. Okay? They did not adopt the universality of the Declaration's principle, nor did they believe that those principles were incorporated in the Constitution. The Constitution kind of was a self-regulating set of procedures without any reference to substantive moral ends that would guide it. Okay? I want to now look a little more deeply at Lincoln's view of the Declaration of Independence as crucial, the apple of gold to his statesmanship. And here's something from his speech in 1854. Excuse me, the word Negro was used in this context at the time. I'm going to use it here. There are two metaphors that I would like us to revive. One, Lincoln refers to the Declaration of Independence as our ancient faith and the sheet anchor of American republicanism. And here, his understanding of human equality, all men are created equal, is a recognition of our common humanity, its common dignity, and its common depravity. He says, if the Negro is a man, while my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal and that there can be no moral right in connection with one's making a slave of another. No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. I say this is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicanism. This is as early as 1854. And of course, the ancient faith anticipates the Gettysburg Address, right? But new birth of freedom. Our fathers came forth upon this continent. It is the basis of the American creed, and it is a standard to judge the progress, moral progress of the nation. The principles command and forbid actions. Equality, as I mentioned, is a statement here of our common humanity, its equal dignity and its equal depravity, I will say, tendency to abuse power. Consent is the operative principle of that. You know, I can't say it better than Lincoln. No man is good enough to govern another man without that man's consent, right? To apply a little political philosophy to this, that no man is good enough presumes that man is neither a beast nor a god. Slavery, the principle of despotism, elevates some to a godlike level and debases others to the level of beasts, and is thus incompatible with the inviolability of our equal dignity. And then there's the sheet anchor analogy. You see this little anchor here. I don't know how many people are sailors in the audience or have yachts. I don't think we use the word sheet anchor anymore, but in the context, it was a particular anchor used in cases of emergency to save the ship. This nautical metaphor that refers to something that is dependable, and figuratively something that one places your complete reliance upon. That was the Declaration of Independence, the ancient faith, the sheet anchor, the apple of gold for Abraham Lincoln. Now, I want to discuss what is called the Federal Consensus on Slavery. From 1787 to 1862, there was wide agreement prior to 1850 in regard to the constitutional status of slavery. And I want to try and as clearly as I can summarize that, because it's crucial to understand the similarities and differences between Lincoln and Douglas. This was also codified in House resolutions. So there's quite a bit of documentation, and the great Daniel Webster speaks of this consensus and this agreement. One, Republicans advocated the motto, and the federal consensus is summed up, of freedom national and slavery local. And this came from, it was inspired by Lord Mansfield's opinion in Somerset versus Stuart, our British relatives across the pond, in 1772. The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced for any reasons, moral or political, but only by positive law. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. That is to say, slavery is the exception to the rule of freedom, and is an odious custom that is only supported by the force of law, and should be contained as much as possible under the circumstances. The federal consensus, and I want you to think the Republican Party in particular, Lincoln's party, former anti-slavery Whigs, believed that the Declaration's principles were universal. They meant what they said. They applied to all human beings in the abstract, and they were embodied in the Constitution as directives to provide guidance. Let's look at their view of the Constitution. They do acknowledge, and here's where we'll see there's a difference between Lincoln and Douglas, concessions to slavery as a state institution under the federal division of power. This federal consensus believed, I think they were correct in understanding the compromises in 1787, that the Constitution had created a firewall between the federal government and the existing institution of slavery in the southern states. That slavery was under the discretion of the states as a local institution. However, interestingly enough, very important, the members of the federal consensus and the Republican Party and Frederick Douglass all denied a national right to property in a slave. They rejected Roger B. Taney's transformation of slavery local into the nationalization of slavery. As I mentioned, slavery was to be the exception to the rule, okay, and tolerated locally. And I'll provide evidence of at least how Douglas interprets this. The Constitution also authorizes the federal restriction of slavery in the territories. Most importantly, they cite the Northwest Ordinance. In 1787, the first Congress of the United States banned slavery in the vast territory of the Northwest, from which the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin would fortuitously enter the Union as free states. Slavery was banned there, and here's a very important example of a federal precedent for restricting slavery. But it tolerates slavery as a local institution. Also, the federal consensus supported what was known as, or understood, the concessions to slavery in terms of the argument of necessity, which I'll provide an example of in a moment. They were committed to the ultimate extinction of slavery. For Lincoln and the Republicans, it was to be gradual, peaceful, with the consent of the states, and compensated, and also tied, controversially, or to colonization. However, by the 1830s, former President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, in resisting the gag rule, Southern efforts to prevent any discussion of abolishing slavery in the House, any consideration of it, articulated this doctrine of military necessity, that if a war ever broke out between the sections, if there was a military necessity, that the slaves could be emancipated to preserve the Union dedicated to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. This, my friends, was like a loaded gun. And it was something that Republicans, that anti-slavery forces, abolitionists, and more moderate Republicans, was a doctrine they all were aware of. Evidence shows that quite convincingly. James Oakes' book's Freedom National is really worth reading in that regard. Let's look at Lincoln's argument of necessity. I wish we could perhaps, mention this to students today, to consult Lincoln. We had slaves among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle of equality in our Charter of Liberties, right? So apple of gold, Charter of Liberties, sheet anchor of American republicanism. Let's now turn to Frederick Douglass and consider some of the differences and similarities between them. Douglass also saw the Declaration of Independence as the moral centerpiece of the Union, as a charter of freedom. And what to the slave is the 4th of July, one of the greatest speeches in American history, up there with the Gettysburg Address. He describes the Declaration in these terms. I have said that the Declaration is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. So indeed, I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Be true to them on all occasions and in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost. This speech is a rhetorical masterpiece, and part of it is this tension between your 4th of July and mine, the tension between inclusion and exclusion, and it's clear that dramatizes and highlights the injustice of stripping Douglass of his rights and of pointing out America's hypocrisy on this day. It's delivered from, of course, the perspective of a slave. What to the slave, I mean, grammatically, the slave is front and center, is the 4th of July. The beginning of the speech praises the founders. In fact, Douglass regards the founders as proto-abolitionists, at least in spirit. They were bound by necessity. He agrees with Lincoln here. It's not the founders' fault so much. Sure, they should be blamed, but they started off on the right foot. It's succeeding generations that have betrayed the ancient faith. And here Douglas's speech takes a famous rhetorical reversal. It goes from praise to condemnation. Of course, he uses the ring bolt as a metaphor, another metaphor like the apple of gold. What is a ring bolt? Another nautical analogy. It holds the ship of state steady. But I believe, I can't prove this, but I believe, spending some time with Douglas, that there's an intentional irony here, in an alternative reading, that the ring bolt not only can hold the ship of state steady, it also could hold a slave in his place. As I mentioned, there's a rhetorical reversal from praising the founders to then condemning them for their hypocrisy, from their backsliding from the ancient faith. And here's the beginning of it. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? A day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. And then there's the kicker. Douglas, of course, and Lincoln both quoted the Bible copiously and used biblical metaphors, the apple of gold and the picture of silver from Proverbs. Here, Douglas invokes Psalm 137. He quotes it. I didn't quote it here, but do you men citizens mean to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. And of course, Psalm 137 is a reference to the Babylonian captivity. By the waters of Babylon we wept. It was after the destruction of Israel. The Israelites, the Jews, have been taken into captivity by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians were taunting them to play music on their harp during this. So it's an absolutely heart-wrenching psalm. And Douglas likens his effort to speak on the Declaration of Independence in a comparable way. I want to now consider, we've looked at Douglas's the view of the Declaration of Independence and the gap between principle and practice that's profoundly called out in What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Let's look at Douglas's mature understanding of the Constitution. Initially, Douglas was a Garrisonian abolitionist who did see the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, but he changed his mind. He began to have conversations with Gerrit Smith and with a sect known as the political abolitionists. And by the time he wrote even What to the Slave is the 4th of July, he viewed the Constitution as a glorious liberty document, interestingly enough, that mandated the immediate abolition of slavery. Let's take a look at Douglas's reasoning. Douglas's reasoning of the Constitution is like Scalia's textualism on steroids. It is a strict, literal, if you've read Scalia's philosophy of textualism and originalism, he subscribes to a strict, literal construction of the words of the text. This may be called textualism. He disregards precedent in history because he says precedent in history could be wrong. And so when we interpret the Constitution, we should not resort to precedent or secret interpretations. There was a debate about at that time what some of the founders thought in private and whether or not this was authoritative. Douglas says we need to disregard this. He clearly interprets the Declaration as universal and believes that the universal principles of the Declaration are embodied in the Constitution through the preamble, right? The preamble refers to the blessings of liberty. Also, the Republican clause of Article 4, which guarantees the states a Republican form of government. Douglas and many of the abolitionists thought that this clause was an anti-slavery clause because it should be interpreted through the lens of the Declaration of Independence. And therefore, any state that entered the Union should be a free state. Law must be construed, this is his doctrine of interpretation, in favor of justice and liberty. Where a law is susceptible to two meanings, this is Douglas, the one making it accomplish an innocent purpose and the other making it accomplish a wicked purpose, we must in all cases adopt that which makes it accomplish an innocent purpose. Douglas makes much of the fact, as does Lincoln, that the Constitution neither mentions the word slave nor slavery. Slaves are referred to persons or persons held to service or labor. From this, he deduces there is no national right to property in a slave. Madison goes on record in his notes, which Douglas disregards, but which Lincoln actually adduces as support in his view, as saying the reason they did not mention slave or slavery in the Constitution is because they did not wish to admit that there could be property in men. And going back to the federal consensus that slavery is a local institution that is tolerated as a matter of necessity. Slaves are referred to persons. Very often, I hear students say slaves were degraded to 3/5 of a person. Okay, well, if slaves were counted fully, it would have been a great victory for the South, a greater victory for the South if they were counted fully as 5/5. And Douglas actually kind of engages in a rhetorical jujitsu and says that slaves are referred to as 3/5 of a person recognizing their potential future freedom. So it's also a brilliant counterattack to the pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. Douglas does not acknowledge the concessions to slavery under federalism. In fact, he does not believe that the Constitution authorizes the return of fugitives, notwithstanding Article 4, the fugitive slave provision. And he believes that the Constitution authorizes the immediate abolition of slavery. Okay, remember, under the federal consensus and for Lincoln, there was that firewall. Federalism prohibited the federal government from interfering with state slavery. Douglas rejects that. Okay, let's look at what Douglas has to say. I know this is a long quote, but it's priceless. The constitutionality of slavery can be made out only by disregarding the plain and common sense reading of the Constitution itself, by discrediting and casting away as worthless the most beneficent rules of legal interpretation, by ruling the Negro outside these beneficent rules, by claiming everything for slavery, by denying everything for freedom, by assuming that the Constitution does not mean what it says and that it is saying what it does not mean, by disregarding the written Constitution and interpreting it in the light of a secret understanding. It is in this mean, contemptible and underhanded method that the American Constitution is pressed into the service of slavery. Powerful words from a former slave and the leading African American at the time who seeks to vindicate the Constitution. Douglas also at the end of the speech anticipates emancipation as a military necessity. Here he's following John Quincy Adams that I mentioned before. If it should turn out that slavery is a source of insurrection, that there is no security from insurrection while slavery lasts, why the Constitution would be best obeyed by putting an end to slavery. And of course, this is the conclusion Lincoln comes to in 1863, not without much criticism from Douglas. To summarize, Lincoln's view before the war. He shares the federal consensus. One, he distinguishes between the extension of slavery and its existence in the state. The territories, because they are under the auspices of the federal government and because there is ample historical precedent, okay, slavery may be prohibited there. State slavery is different, according to Lincoln, right? There the firewall exists. He views the history of slavery in terms of the argument of necessity. It's only tolerated because a greater evil would have resulted if there were not compromises made, namely the dismemberment of the Union early on. He supports a path to ultimate extinction. We should always be guided by the moral compass of the Declaration of Independence. Freedom national, slavery local. Lincoln here also distinguishes, and this is controversial in our time, between slavery and racial equality. He does not believe at this time that the Constitution authorizes integration of the races federally. This is a local matter. In his state of Illinois, there was a Black exclusion law, this is remarkable, that in fact, a black exclusion law that in fact prohibited free African Americans from entering into the state. I want to mention one thing here, the 3 meetings between Lincoln and Douglas during the war. The first meeting was in August 10th, 1863. And here, Douglas was at the White House, and he sought Lincoln, and his major complaints were that Lincoln had not retaliated against the murder of black soldiers, and also that they were not being paid equally. Finally, he also complained at this first meeting that that there should be equal and fair promotion of black soldiers. Lincoln, at this time, said it was with great difficulty that he could get colored soldiers enlisted at all. That came with the Emancipation Proclamation. And that the prejudices existing against him. Lincoln said that the country needed talking up to on the point. Lincoln may walk slowly, Douglas later said, but he never walked backward. And in fact, at the second meeting, Lincoln summons Douglas to the White House. And here, Lincoln says that it's likely that he's going to lose election, and he wants to get the word of the final Emancipation Proclamation out before the Democrats revoke it. Okay, remarkable. So he actually asked Douglas to lead a band of armed African-American scouts to spread the word of emancipation throughout the South and to foment further slave rebellions. Douglas is astonished. And after this second meeting, Douglas's criticism of Lincoln stops. The third meeting was Lincoln's second inaugural of March 4th, 1865. And Douglas went to see Lincoln at the reception and was shuffled out a wing. Lincoln saw him and made a point of greeting him and said, "I want to know what you think about this speech, his second inaugural." And of course, Lincoln says, Douglas famously said, that was a sacred effort. That was a sacred effort. After Lincoln's assassination, and I'm almost concluding here, after Lincoln's assassination, Douglas said this on June 1st, 1865, "No people or class of people in the country have a better reason for lamenting the death of Abraham Lincoln and for desiring the honor to perpetuate his memory than have the colored people. Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president, the first to show any respect for his rights." But of course, you famously remember in 1876, he refers to Lincoln as the white man's president. So which one was it? Well, if we look carefully at this speech in 1876, Douglas does a rhetorical reversal and praises Lincoln. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have inevitably driven from him a powerful class of American people and rendered resistance to the rebellion impossible. So Douglas is looking at Lincoln from the standpoint of a radical abolitionist ground. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln was tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent, but measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. This is, in conclusion, this is a painting one of my friends did 20 years ago. Her name's Wendy Williams. She's an artist in Gettysburg. I encourage you to check out her studios. But in conclusion, what lesson can be learned from the convergence between these two men? What do they say about the principles, perils, and promise of democracy, the similarities and difference between reform, leadership, and statesmanship, and the convergence between the two in a common cause? We see Douglas embracing politics, a more prudent politics, and praising Lincoln towards the end of the war and later in his life. In Lincoln, of course, embracing Black suffrage, civil rights, and Black conscription. Well, both of these men defend our core principles while recognizing that in practice, we've fallen short. I would like us to return, especially here in Philadelphia, to these metaphors of the ring bolt, the apple of gold, the picture of silver, the ancient faith, the sheet anchor, and to paraphrase Lincoln, that in defending our Constitution and defending our Union, let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, do our duty as we understand it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was wonderful. Thank you. We do have a few moments for questions. Rebecca or Jim, do you have a microphone there? Are there questions? Yes, right here.
I know your what I consider to be this brilliant talk you just gave was focused on Lincoln and Douglas. But what I'm curious about is what your thoughts are on what Jefferson's thoughts were when he authored the Declaration of Independence.
I do believe Jefferson, I think there's ample evidence to support the view that Jefferson saw equality as a universal principle. Of course, in the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, he condemns the slave trade. And in earlier work in 1774 called A Summary of the Rights of the North American Colonies, he refers to slavery and the slave trade as a cruel war against human nature and a violation of human rights. Now, Jefferson, complex character, right? I think thought slavery was wrong in principle. He did not envision a multiracial society as Douglas did. I think there he falls short. But he also warns of divine judgment and notes on the state of Virginia that in a contest between the slave and the master, divine justice is on the side of the slave and the wheel of fortune can turn. It's a remarkable statement, and Lincoln and other anti-slavery sources would cite it against Southerners.
So, if you question the founding fathers' intentions, all those questions were kind of answered with the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. Clear indication of what they believed. So, is Douglas's issue the timing when the North triggered a civil war, when he said, the Constitution mandates abolition? So is he saying, hey, you guys knew it in 1787, that was the time to trigger the war? Or does he look at this practical solution that we ended up going through, where, I don't want to say slow walk, but maybe we slow walked it to the 1860s?
He believes Lincoln's moving too slow, and even though he breaks with Garrison, he's always demanding the immediate end to slavery, and he's not compromising with, let's say, the odious fugitive slave laws. I don't know what I would do, right? I mean, if the law compels you to return a runaway fugitive. So there is that element of immediatism, and he believes the Constitution authorizes it. So in other words, if there's a majority in the United States that could vote for abolishing slavery in the slave states, that would be legitimate. For Lincoln and most of the members of the federal consensus prior to the 13th Amendment, that would be illegitimate. That's why emancipation was undertaken as a matter of military necessity, because it was within the rule of law.
I have one right here.
You mentioned that in the second meeting, Lincoln summoned him and asked him to lead some commando bands.
Yeah, unbelievable. John Brown's idea.
Well, did he do it? What happened? And how could he do that?
Great question. It never went through. And Chase, I think, was implicated in doing it, but Lincoln didn't lose. This was really the low point of Lincoln's administration. Grant was stymied. The body count was just immense. You're thinking like the battles of Cold Harbor. And the country was war weary, and there was a considerable copperhead opposition to the Lincoln administration, accusing it of suspending civil liberties and engaging in a war to enslave white men and free black men. Things looked very bleak for Lincoln. He actually wrote a private memo that we found conceding defeat. But then something happens. Last day of August, first day of September, Sherman captures Atlanta, and the whole game changes.
Rebecca, back there.
11 years after Lincoln was assassinated, they dedicated the Emancipation Monument in
Yes.
DC, where Douglas spoke, and he spoke about Lincoln not only being a black man's president, but also the white man's president.
Yeah, I mentioned that. Yes.
Right. Could you elaborate more on what he meant?
That
by white
I
man's
know,
president?
it's so rich. In 1865, he refers to Lincoln as the black man's president after his assassination. And then in 1876 at the Freedom's Memorial, the Emancipation Memorial, he refers to Lincoln as the white man's president, and referring to African-Americans as only his stepchildren. Of course, I think Douglas is addressing an African-American audience who had just paid for this monument, right? It was all the contributions came from the African-American community in the United States, in particular DC. And I think he had to make some acknowledgement, given his criticisms of Lincoln. And I didn't have time to get into them. Some of them are quite humorous, but strong. And he refers to Lincoln as an imbecile and the imbecility of the government. So I think he has to account in some way for those criticisms. He didn't believe the administration moved fast enough. But the major point is, after this, he tempers that condemnation. It's again that rhetorical reversal where he says that Lincoln is actually on abolitionist ground. He had to deal with the prejudices. He had to accommodate the prejudices of a white nation, right, where blacks were excluded. And of course, I would say one more thing I would say, and I'm wrestling with this, it's complex, right? Douglas's later speeches are all very laudatory of Lincoln. There's many other speeches that are laudatory of Lincoln. Even after he meets Lincoln the first time, he speaks in Philadelphia to an abolitionist society and said, I wonder if you'd like to know how I was treated. And he said, I was treated as one man treats another, as a gentleman.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Joe Fornieri. Joe, thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you. Thank you. Really great, Joe. Thank you.
Good.
Yep. So we have a program on April 25th, a public affairs program, Future of Philadelphia, Business and Economic Competitiveness, with three of our Union League members, Jerry Sweeney, Craig Carnarali, and Steve Mullen. And then we have a Royal Oak program on May 2nd. And if you want more Lincoln, we have May 25th. Our next Civil War Roundtable is Alan Gelzo, Redeemer President.
My friend.
It's a wonderful, wonderful book and talk, and we look forward to seeing you next week on the 25th. Thank you. Have a great evening.